Welcome back. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, good. There's a switch. Welcome back for the second in our series of lectures on cold facts about hot spots. I think you'll find this evening is going to be another really interesting lecture. Following last week's overview of current foreign policy issues, tonight's speaker will focus on Syria, one of the 5 hotspots highlighted by Anne-Marie Slaughter last week. Before I go on with the introduction, I do want to tell you that on April 2nd, which was an opening that we had in Anfield, we do have Professor Susie Kim from Rutgers University who is going to talk on North Korea, so put that down on your calendar, and that should be interesting. And if you have a cell phone on your person, please be sure it's off. Thank you. Our speaker tonight is Christian Sonner, and he knows Syria rather well. He lived there and in Lebanon at various times from 2008 to 2012. And he's currently writing a book called Among the Ruins, A Journey Through the Many Syrias. Look for it on Amazon when it gets published. This draws on his experiences living in Syria, and he's going to share some of those insights with us this evening. He's also among the organizers of a new working group on Syrian heritage in crisis, being organized jointly by Princeton University, the Alliance for the Restoration of Cultural Heritage in Washington, D.C., and the Smithsonian. He collaborates with Professor Stanley Katz to produce a conference on, he's going to do this, by the way, to produce a conference on the protection of cultural property, that is, historical sites and structures of great importance in Syria because of the destruction that is now going on there in the civil war. But his day job is actually completing his PhD thesis. He's working with Professors Michael Cook and Peter Brown, and exploring the emergence of a sectarian culture among Muslims and Christians between the 7th and 9th centuries. And he works on materials written at that time in Arabic, Greek, Syriac, and Latin. And I'm praying he's talking this evening in English. As a master's candidate here, he studied early Islamic history and the modern Middle East, and was a teaching fellow for Professor Bernard Haeckel, who is an expert on Syria, and in his course on the politics of modern Islam. He also participated in the Woodrow Wilson School workshop on Syria, led by Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, who is speaking later in the series on Egypt. Christians graduated summa cum laude from Princeton in 2007 with a major in art and archaeology, in which he won the senior thesis prize. He was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship and earned a Master of Philosophy with distinction at St. John's College, Oxford in 2009. He then earned an additional master's at Princeton in 2011 and continues here on his way to a PhD. He's also received a Barclay Fellowship from the Wall Street Journal and continues to write articles on the culture and history of the Middle East for the Journal and other academic and popular publications. So I'm feeling very fortunate to be hearing Christian Sonner this evening because he has so much experience on the background of the current conflict and is here to share with us his understanding sectarianism in Syria. Christian, thank you for coming.
delighted to be here. It's great to meet all of you. I look forward to speaking with you after the lecture. I grew up in a town called Maplewood, which is about an hour north of here in Essex County. And Maplewood has a very dynamic and very active adult school that I and my siblings and my parents participated in over the years. So I'm thrilled to learn of its existence here in Princeton and glad to see it's under such great stewardship. So thank you very much for inviting me. As Maruf said in her introduction, my curiosity in Syria began on several personal visits there. I actually had very little to do with the Middle East as an undergraduate here at Princeton. My curiosity was piqued relatively late in my short life, which is to say when I left Princeton to head to Oxford. It was mostly by chance that I started spending my summers in Syria and I was learning Arabic. And needless to say, little did I know what would come of Syria in those years before the revolution. Almost an event that you could see happening so clearly based on the events and the circumstances on the ground, but at the same time something that would never come to pass. So anyway, I have found myself in my own small way on the edge of a world that I studied very briefly, very intensely, and now confronts all of us in our nation's newspapers, on the evening news, etc. So before I begin, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, the volume's good. So the topic tonight, as you can see up here, is sectarianism in Syria, which I think is an oft remarked upon but poorly understood asset or facet of the conflict. I thought before we delve into the history of sectarianism in Syria, it would be worthwhile to just run down the facts. No doubt they'll be familiar to many of you, but I think it's worth bearing these in mind as we dig into some of the nitty-grittier aspects of it. So all of this begins in March 2011, in which a group of boys started scribbling graffiti on the wall of a relatively small, I would say second or third tier city in the south of Syria called Daraa, not very far from the Jordanian border. These events represented the first outburst of what the media was then calling the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, of course, had broken out several months before, in November 2010, when a fruit seller in Tunisia, irritated at having to pay a bribe to the corrupt police one more time, set himself on fire. And this dramatic act of disobedience began to inspire countless other peoples in other Middle Eastern countries. And so the so-called Arab Spring, which began in Tunisia, quickly ignited in Egypt and other parts of the Middle East, and relatively speaking, spread fairly late to Syria, several months later in March 2011. The movement began primarily as strings of peaceful demonstrations, mostly around the Friday prayers. So Friday afternoons, it was very common to hear about people congregating in big cities and protesting. The great chant of the Arab Spring, as it was in Egypt, and so in Syria, was the people want the fall of the regime. People want the fall of this system. And so what began as a peaceful revolution quickly devolved into a nationwide armed conflict, in which these demonstrations faded in favor of street-to-street guerrilla fighting, aerial bombardments, etc., the news that we're hearing about right now. So this is a somewhat chameleon-like conflict, and so labels are both significant and relatively unimportant. But it's worth noting that when the media talks about the Arab Spring, and especially the way it's manifested itself in Syria, they use a lot of different labels. Do we call it the Arab Spring, connecting it to a wider phenomenon that is spreading across the region? Do we call it the Syrian Revolution? Do we call it a Syrian civil war? So as I talk tonight, keep these questions in mind because I think that they are relevant for understanding the nature of the conflict up to now and perhaps where it's heading. What are the causes of this so-called Syrian revolution? As throughout the rest of the Middle East, we can pinpoint a number of very, very obvious causes. First and foremost, this is a movement that is a response to decades of authoritarian rule. The Middle East is the home to some of the most notorious police states on the planet, and Syria stands at the top of the heap, renowned as probably the most ruthless of them all. It's also a response to a sluggish economy, and a sluggish economy that has hit at the very same time that a huge youth bulge hits the workforce. So we're talking about a country that is filled with young people who do not have good prospects of employment, and where power, political authority, and wealth are often awarded to those who benefit from middlemen and contacts within the government. And of course, I mentioned the effect of regional events, the manner in which a political movement in one country has spread to many, many others in the region. The next two characteristics to keep in mind are related. First, the nature of this is an internal struggle within Syrian society. What do I mean by that? The main fault line, as you all know, is between the regime, the Ba'athist regime, led by President Bashar al-Assad, which has been in power since 1971. His father became president. And opposing the regime is a network of loosely connected opposition groups. And when I talk about internal division, it's really on this side of the ledger. Within this opposition, we have representatives of secular liberal groups, and these people had early prominence in councils that were set up in places like Istanbul, like Paris, and increasingly in the Persian Gulf countries. And in addition to these, the next most prominent group, if not the most prominent, certainly on the battlefield, are various coalitions of Islamist fighters. And under this umbrella, I would count the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the oldest, probably the most established, most deeply rooted Islamist movement in the country, familiar to many of you from Egypt and other countries in the region. And then to the right of the Muslim Brotherhood, we have the so-called networks of the Salafis. Salafis are essentially Muslim fundamentalists. And these are groups that have received their funding largely from countries like Saudi Arabia. And so, in the particular case of the Salafis, we have networks of transnational jihadis. And by that I mean, many of the people who were doing the heavy lifting on the battlefield are not themselves necessarily Syrian. They have cut their teeth fighting American troops in Iraq, fighting the regime of Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, and have now come to Syria as nearly the latest wave in an ongoing regional jihad. It's also a proxy war. We spoke about the internal conditions, but the external conditions are almost as important. So the Syrian revolution has largely become a proxy war between two different groups of international actors. On the part of the regime, we have prominent supporters including Iran, probably its most important regional ally. And then above Iran, we have countries like Russia and China. And on the side of the opposition, we have an equally variegated network of supporters. Principally, we have the Sunni Muslim Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, among others. We also have the United States, the European Union, all supporting the opposition with different levels of logistical, military, and financial support. But I think that the nature of the conflict speaks for itself most poignantly in the statistics. So this morning I went online. According to current UN estimates, there are 70,000 dead as a result of the revolution, although that number is widely viewed as being smaller than the actual figure, largely because it's hard to count, to verify these deaths. And much the same could be said of the 600,000 refugees who churn along Syria's borders. And that does not include, by the way, the number of internally displaced peoples within the country of Syria. So that's setting the stage. So understanding sectarianism in Syria. Among the numerous adjectives used to describe the ongoing conflict in Syria, the term sectarian is perhaps the most common. In recent months, articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, and others have reported, quote, fears rise that Assad is trying to stoke sectarian war. That's from August 2012. Syria's sectarian fears keep the region on edge, February 2012. Spate of kidnappings raises specter of sectarian strife in Syria, February 2013, this month. And Syria's conflict turns sectarian as ethnic divisions grow, from December. And I could cite countless other examples. This is a buzzword, sectarian. These stories focus mostly on the rising tensions between the Alawis, the minority sect of President Bashar al-Assad, practitioners of a traditionally secretive offshoot of Shi'i Islam, and Syria's Sunni Muslim opposition, much of which regards the Alawis as heretics in matters of faith and partisans of a deeply criminal government. There are reports of Alawi militias massacring Sunni villages, of Sunni militants seizing Alawi hostages, and anti-government demonstrators warning Christians to, quote, get to Beirut, to, quote, get to Beirut, and for the Alawis to get to the Thabut. So this is a rhyme in Arabic, Beirut and Thabut. Thabut means coffin. So for the Christians to get to Beirut, and for the Alawis to get to the grave. So if we trust the New York Times and other respectable media outlets, what we are witnessing is the unfolding of the deeper religious war in Syria. A political struggle between haves and have-nots, charged by older, more trenchant rivalries between different faiths and communities. But how do we define sectarianism in Syria? Where did it come from? Has it always existed? Or was it created out of thin air by the particular circumstances, tensions, and pressures of the Arab Spring? For our purposes, I will define sectarianism as the activation of religious identity, real or perceived, for divisive political and social gain. The process is driven usually by a need to differentiate among groups whose relationships are, I think, under most other circumstances, characterized by relative coexistence, cultural similarity, and geographic proximity. Put differently, sectarianism, especially in the Middle East, is a phenomenon that is periodic, it is sporadic, and inconsistent, which can make tracing its historical origins very, very difficult. So, as Maru said in her introduction, I am a historian, unlike your other august speakers in this series, among whom I'm rather intimidated to be counted. Dan Kurtzer, Ambassador Dan Kurtzer, was a teacher of mine, and Anne-Marie Slaughter, that name speaks for itself. But I'm a historian, I'm not at the Woodrow Wilson School. But all the same, I'm hopeful that as a historian, I can give you the kind of deep background that is all too often missing from political discussions about Syria, but which is crucially important for understanding the revolution. In this talk, I will attempt to explain the 19th and 20th century roots of sectarianism in Syria. In my judgment, it is impossible to disentangle this from a wider historical shift that affected many other parts of the Middle East, namely the rise of minority communities as the principal brokers of political power during the late Ottoman period and in the early 20th century after World War I. This is the story of outsiders who became insiders, of groups who throughout history stood on the margins of society, but who came to dominate the halls of influence thanks to wider sea changes in the Ottoman and interwar periods. This is a story I could tell from multiple perspectives, whether Syria's Christians, the Druze community, or others. But in the interest of explaining this torrid season in which we find ourselves, I shall focus on the most successful of Syria's minority groups, and now also the most besieged, the Alawis. So here, just by way of introduction, we have an image of President Bashar al-Assad, surrounded on either side of whom are two Sunni Muslims. The man on the right here is a Sunni cleric. So we'll get into why an Alawi Muslim, like the president, is in this picture photographed praying in a Sunni mosque. This is among the peculiar features of Syrian political culture, but that's for the end of the lecture. So I think it's first best to go through a brief tour of Syria's geography and how that geography maps onto the distribution of different religious communities. So, like the rest of the Arab Middle East, the people of Syria are overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim, around 75% of an overall population of 22 million. Sunnis are spread throughout the country, from the large agro-cities of the west, and by this I mean Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus, which you can see here on the left side of the map. This is basically the breadbasket of Syria. The next largest group are the Alawis, as I said, followers of a branch of Shiism that emerged in the 9th century, and they today make up around 11% of the population, or around 2.2 million people. Shiism generally is the second largest denomination of Islam in the world. So this is a sub-branch of Shiism. And what differentiates the Shia
from their Sunni counterparts is the belief that leadership of the Muslim community belongs to the descendants of Prophet Muhammad, beginning with his cousin Ali, who is the so-called first imam in the Shi'i tradition. The Alawis specifically believe in the divinity of this Ali, hence their name, Alawi meaning those who follow, those who revere Ali. They also believe in the rejection of the idea of a resurrection and also the transmigration of souls, doctrines which put them at odds with most Muslims, Sunni and Shi'i alike. Historically, the Alawis were concentrated in the destitute mountainous region just south of the Turkish border. This is an area that was traditionally known as Jebel Ansariya, and it's right up here. So as you can see on the map, this is the dark green area. This is the Alawi homeland. So Latakia is the principal port of Syria, and Tartus is right behind it. So as I said, this was a traditionally destitute part of Syria, extremely poor. But thanks to new prominence in the armed services in the 20th century, many Alawis left these enclaves and spread to coastal cities such as Latakia and Tartus, as well as to neighborhoods in and around Damascus and Aleppo, the two biggest cities in Syria. There are also the Christians, which is my particular area of expertise and interest. And the Christians form a dwindling 5 to 10% of Syria's population. The single largest denomination of Christians in the country is Greek Orthodox, followed by smaller communities of Greek Catholics, Syrian Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Maronites, and others. So if you think Main Street USA is diverse with the Presbyterian Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, on and on, go to Damascus. All these people are there. So as the map indicates, or as a matter of fact does not indicate, Christians live throughout the country, though they tend to congregate in cities and certain rural pockets, such as an area called Wadi al-Nasara, which in Arabic means the Valley of the Christians. And that's basically this area right here. So the map does not indicate the concentration of Christian communities in the big cities, but rather it indicates their more rural hinterland in which they predominate. So that's right here. And very significantly, you'll notice that the Alawi heartlands in the north, this mountainous region, overlaps with these traditionally Christian areas, and it also overlaps with predominantly Muslim areas. And so this shaded band right here, where all three overlap, has not surprisingly been home to some of the fiercest fighting during the course of the Civil War. Members of the Druze sect, another offshoot of Shi'i Islam, which formed in the 10th century, are concentrated in the southern district known as Suwaida, down here. So very close to the Jordanian border. And the Druze make up roughly 3% of Syria's population. The Ismailis, another Shi'i group, form a tiny but important sliver, not more than 1% of the population, concentrated in an agricultural belt near the city of Hama. And that's what's indicated here. These are very light green shades. These are predominantly Ismaili groups. There used to be a sizable Jewish community in Syria as well, but as in many parts of the Middle East in recent decades, it has all but disappeared, drained by warfare and immigration to places like Europe, the United States, and to Israel. And we have many here in New Jersey, as many of you may know. So what I want to convey through this brief description is that Syria is both diverse and divided. It is home to a stunning array of confessional communities whose existence defies easy characterization of the wider Middle East as a cultural and religious monolith. Furthermore, I should stress at the outset that the existence of sectarian difference does not necessarily entail the occurrence of violence. Especially in the past half-century or so, relations among Syria's sects have been largely peaceful. And in this respect, Syria's trajectory has diverged from that of neighbors like Lebanon and Iraq, which share much of Syria's religious diversity, but whose recent history has been marked by deep confessional discord. I would like to argue today that the dilemma of the minority in Syria has been the experience of living between particularism on the one hand, and by that I mean sectarian political particularism, and universalism on the other. It is the dilemma of belonging to communities of dissent, who would voluntarily resist the religious mainstream, and by that I mean the Sunni Muslim mainstream, while at the same time very often subscribing to political ideologies, belonging to political parties that urge integration and equality. It is a tension that has affected practically every sectarian community in Syria, from the Alawis and the Christians to the Druze, the Ismailis, and other Shi'i groups. And it has shaped major political developments in Syria for decades, including the present revolution. So to understand the roots of this tension, we must go back to the early 19th century, when Syria was still a province of the Ottoman Empire, then caught up in the modernizing fervor of the age. The last great Muslim power in world history, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the Balkans to the walls of Baghdad, as you can see on this map. With such a geographic reach, its population perhaps inevitably included large numbers of religious minorities, both Muslim minorities, like the Shi'is, the Alawis, the Yazidis of Iraq, and the Druze, as well as non-Muslims, such as Christians and Jews. Under traditional Islamic law, non-Muslims were regarded as what is called dhimmis, which is an Arabic word that basically means the people of the covenant. As such, these dhimmis were subject to special taxes and restrictions different from those of their Muslim neighbors. In theory, they enjoyed the full protection of the state, and indeed, in contrast to their minority counterparts in Europe, some Jews and Christians in Ottoman lands practically flourished, ascending to the highest echelons of political and economic life. Despite this success, however, most non-Muslims, and I should say heterodox Muslims, non-Sunni Muslims, lived under a system that was, by our contemporary standards, very unfair. The very notion of a dhimmi, this person of the covenant, a protected individual, reflected a two-tiered model of citizenship, with, quote, Orthodox Muslims, Sunni Muslims. Let's see if this microphone works.
Cover your ears. I hope this works.
We're good? Okay. Oh.
Let me see if I can project. That may be best. Okay. Well, you fiddle with that. I'm just going to keep going. Okay, so as I was saying, the very notion of the dhimmi reflected a two-tiered model of citizenship, with, quote, Orthodox Muslims enjoying a fuller suite of rights and opportunities than their Jewish and Christian neighbors. Is my volume okay? Yes. In the early 19th century, this began to change. A continent away, the Enlightenment had popularized the notion of equality before the law. Before long, this idea had permeated the Ottoman court, and along with it, concepts such as individual rights, free market economics, and respect for private property. The buzz generated a flood of liberalizing, secularizing reforms, affecting everything from the organization of the Ottoman army to taxation, state bureaucracy, and the law. These reforms were referred to collectively as the Tanzimat, which I've written up here. I've tried to tone down the strange Arabic words, but some of these are extremely important, and Tanzimat is one of them. It basically means reforms, reorganization of the imperial system. In the year 1839, in a place called Gülhane Park, in the shade of the imperial palace in Istanbul, Topkapi Palace, maybe some of you have been there, Ottoman reformers promulgated a document, as I said, it's called the Gülhane Decree. Gülhane basically means rose garden, referring to the place where this thing was signed. A follow-up decree was issued in the year 1856, a few years later. Together, they promised all Ottoman subjects, quote, perfect security for life, honor, and property. In addition, and significantly, they guaranteed religious freedom and legal equality for all non-Muslims. Henceforth, at least in theory, Christians and Jews would enjoy the same basic rights as Muslims, overturning a centuries-old legal consensus in Islam, which regarded Jews, Christians, and these non-conformist Muslim groups as second-class citizens. Although the changes initiated at Burhane Park in the mid-19th century are remembered for advancing the status of minorities, reformers were motivated by numerous strategic and political concerns, not all of them altruistic. The most important of these was the desire to promote the idea of Ottomanism. Ottomanism was the notion that the subjects of the empire should share a common political and cultural identity, one that transcended the divisive ties of religion, ethnicity, etc., that were seen by reformers as fragmenting this extremely large and extremely diverse society. But by the late 19th century, these universalizing ambitions had backfired. Instead of creating a society in which all subjects, regardless of their religion, enjoyed the same status before the law, the reforms ended up reinforcing the very religious particularism that it had set out to erase. There are manifold reasons for this, but among the most important was a problem inherent in the idea of Ottomanism itself. Reformers had sought to fashion a new identity, capacious enough to embrace the various sects inside the empire. But the vocabulary available to these reformers in framing such an Ottomanism was itself surprisingly thin. To be a good Ottoman was to be a good Muslim, and what is more, a good Sunni Muslim of the state-sponsored school of law. So we're talking about a very thin identity that is in turn extrapolated and intended to be imposed on all of society. This identity was universal only in the sense that it coincided with the identity of the empire's ruling elites. It would be a top-down, aspirational universalism, ideologically pure and honoring the Sultan's role as the defender of the faith, but it left many subjects out in the cold, either those who could not fit the description or had little desire to conform to it. The religious coloring of Ottomanism became apparent during the reign of the Sultan Abdul Hamid, who ruled at the end of the 19th century. He was a staunch pan-Islamist and sought to enhance the Islamic character of the state by emphasizing the sacrality of his imperial office. He lavished money on religious scholars, on mosques and pious endowments, and even sought to standardize Islamic doctrines through new institutions such as the Commission for the Inspection of Qurans. In other words, the standardization of the text of the Quran that would be common from one end of the empire to the other. The minorities of the Ottoman Empire bore the brunt of this change in policy. Among the ways the state attempted to promote Islamic universalism was by sending missionaries into the provinces to tame these so-called wayward Muslims. From 1891 to 1892, for example, the state tried to convert large numbers of Yazidis to Sunni Islam, a Kurdish ethno-religious minority concentrated in northern Iraq, as we're talking about here. The Yazidis followed a syncretistic religion that blended elements of Zoroastrianism, the pre-Islamic religion of Iran, of Persia, Christianity, and Islam. Others affected by this push for conformity included Bedouin tribes in Syria, Alawi communities in and around the city of Aleppo in Syria, and wayward Muslims in Anatolia, Turkey, who were suspected of flirting with Protestant Christianity through the efforts of missionaries. The Ottoman Empire may have collapsed after World War I, but the era of reform changed the status of minorities forever. On the one hand, the 19th century had empowered Jews, Christians, and these minority Muslim groups by emphasizing Ottomanism over sectarian particularism. But on the other hand, what the empire understood by the term Ottomanism was increasingly fraught with religious connotations. It was a quixotic wager, and ultimately, the minorities found themselves stranded in that treacherous no man's land, between belonging and exile, between the universal impulses of 19th century liberalism and the inescapable particularism of sect and creed. So let's move ahead to the 20th century and see the manner in which these reforms under the Ottoman sultans came to affect the Middle East, and Syria in particular, after the fall of the Empire. So of course, the Ottoman Empire fell after World War I, excuse me. And with it, all possibility of reconfiguring Middle Eastern societies along the lines envisioned by those bold reformers at Buhane Park. It would be replaced, however, by an ideology of equal daring, and I suspect familiar to many of you. An ideology with a similar record of mixed success. This was Arab nationalism, which called for the creation of a pan-Islamic political identity grounded in the cultural and intellectual achievements of Arabic speakers. It owed its inspiration to a group of 19th century writers in places like Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria. These were the trailblazers of what is known in Arabic as the Nahda, which literally means awakening, renaissance. It was an intellectual movement sparked by the European Enlightenment, which urged the modernization and reform of Arab societies. Many of the leading lights of the Nahda were Christians who had profited from education in Western institutions, many of them run by Christian missionaries. I should say you're a Princeton audience. The jewel in the crown of the Christian missionaries, especially those from the United States, is the American University of Beirut, the founders of whom were all affiliated with Princeton University and its seminaries. We're living history. And furthermore, emboldened by the era of reforms, these men offered new narratives of belonging for the communities of the region. Arab nationalism was a brilliant compromise between the universal and the particular. On the one hand, it offered a deeper and more meaningful form of identity than the weak recipe of Ottomanism. But on the other hand, it aimed to transcend historic cleavages among various Arabic speakers. Henceforth, Arabism would embrace peoples as far-flung as Morocco and Iraq, whether they prayed in Sunni or in Shi'i mosques, in Christian churches, in Alawi shrines, and even Jewish synagogues. Of course, Arabism was from the beginning tied closely to Islamic culture. As the minority religion in the Middle East, the majority religion in the Middle East, excuse me, Sunni Islam was the great guardian of Arabism. And many Sunni thinkers played an important role in popularizing the ideology. That said, Arab nationalism offered an alternative identity that aimed to embrace the universal and transcend the particular. As a result, among the greatest early proponents of Arab nationalism in a place like Syria were in fact members of minority communities. An important example of this are the Druze tribes of southern Syria, who we saw earlier, who live close to the Jordanian border, who led a famous revolt against French occupation between 1925 and 1927 in the name of nationalism, in the name of Syrian nationalism. It must be said that for much of the 20th century, it is undeniable that Arab nationalism, in Syria at least, has been associated with one party above the rest. That is the Ba'ath. The Ba'ath is an Arabic word which literally means rising or resurrection. You've probably read it hundreds of times in newspapers. Rarely is it explained what it means. Ba'athism was a movement born of a heady mix of minority interests and universal ideologies that emerged after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Syrian Ba'ath Party of which President Bashar al-Assad is the current leader, was founded in Damascus in the 1930s by two school teachers, the Sunni Muslim Salahuddin Bitar and the Greek Orthodox Christian Michel Aflaq, who's pictured here. Its goals were straightforward: to facilitate the creation of a pan-Arab socialist state, relying on the revolutionary activities of a secret vanguard of activists, much like the vanguard of the proletariat written about in the writings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. From the start, Baathism showed curious attitudes towards religion. On the one hand, it promoted a vision of Arab identity that transcended conventional cleavages among Arabic speakers. Henceforth, there would be no distinctions among Muslims, Christians, or Jews, or among the particular denominations within these larger groups. Yet at the same time, as a matter of historical reflection, it was undeniable that Islam had played a very special role in the creation and dissemination of Arab culture in the Middle East. That the Prophet Muhammad had received his revelation in Arabic, the Quran is written in the Arabic language, that the armies of Islam, comprised mostly of Arab tribesmen, had been the ones responsible for spreading Arab culture across the Middle East. All of this gave the religion special status in an otherwise avowedly secular worldview. The paradoxes inherent in this point of view were evident in many early speeches given by Baathist leaders. Perhaps the most famous was one delivered by the Christian Aflaq at the University of Damascus in the year 1943. It was the anniversary of the Prophet's birth, and Aflaq praised Muhammad as the embodiment of Arabness. In preaching Islam, Aflaq argued, Muhammad had initiated a movement directed at, quote, the renewal of Arabness and its perfection. Muslims were the standard bearers of what he called the eternal Arab message, a message of national community girded by a devotion to justice, to equality, and to freedom. So powerful was the political message of Islam that Michel Aflaq allegedly became a Muslim at the end of his life, realizing that to be a good Arab nationalist was to practice the faith of the Prophet Muhammad, not that of Jesus Christ. So far, we've seen the ways in which Arab nationalism generally, as well as Baathism specifically, appealed to Syria's minority communities. By emphasizing the centrality of Arab language and Arab culture, they reshaped the very frontiers of the majority, providing a sense of belonging to communities that stood warily on the sidelines of history across the centuries. Of course, as we all know, and I suspect this is why you're here, the dissemination and entrenchment of Baathism since the 1960s owes principally to members of one religious community, the Alawis. And here, just by way of introduction, there are lots of these political murals in Syrian cities. So here we have the three most prominent, successful Alawi politicians of the 20th century. The man in the middle, many of you will know, this is Hafez al-Assad, president of Syria from 1971 until his death in 2000. This is his son Bashar, the president of Syria currently. And this is one whom you may not know. His name is Bashar al-Assad, and he was the Dauphin of the House of Assad. He was the heir apparent until he wrapped his car around a telephone pole while he was speaking. So anyway, these are the big three. This is the holy trinity of the Baath Party. In many ways, the rise of the Alawis inside a pan-Arab movement like Baathism was paradoxical, and therefore a subject of profound taboo in Syria for a long time. We couldn't talk about sectarianism. Impolite. The story begins after World War I, when France, charged with the control of Syria under a mandate from the League of Nations, divided the region into various sectarian statelets. They were the vast and predominantly Sunni states centered in Aleppo in the north and Damascus in the south, there was the smaller state carved out for the Druze tribes of the south in an area that was known as Jebel Druze, the mountain of the Druze. Perhaps the most famous of these statelets established after World War I was Lebanon itself, which was carved out by the French largely to accommodate the political interests of its most important clients, the Maronite Christians. The fifth and final of these sectarian statelets, or statelets I should say, that coincided with the historic boundaries of particular confessional communities, was the area of the north. This mountainous heartland of the Adawi people, known throughout history as Jebel Ansari. For centuries, the Adawis had subsisted on the margins of Syrian society. In a country filled with religious dissidents, the Adawis were the most despised of them all. Impoverished practitioners of a Shi'i sect that, in the eyes of many Sunni Muslims, sampled liberally from the beliefs of correct Islam, but also from Christianity and Gnosticism in equal parts. And indeed, according to many academic experts on the history of the Adawi community, there are many pre-Islamic practices, pieties, and beliefs that are incorporated into their theology. But it is also an extremely secretive community, and so it's very hard to say the true nature of these beliefs. For example, a lot of the manuscripts we might use to reconstruct the Adawi belief system are unavailable to scholars. A typical village of the Adawi heartlands was a place called Hordaha. It was the birthplace of President Hafiz al-Assad. One of many faceless farming communities that dotted the mountain wadis, its Adawi inhabitants made meager earnings selling tobacco, lemons, and other crops to coastal merchants. This is only a matter of a few miles from Latakia. I think as the crow flies, it's something like 7 miles to the Mediterranean coast. But because of the elevation, it might as well belong to another world. For centuries, poverty here was trenchant. Families were sometimes forced to make ends meet by selling their daughters into the servitude of the homes of Sunni grandees down below on the coasts. By all reports, Hordaha, the heart of the Assad family, was not a happy place throughout much of history, or much of a place at all. As Gertrude Stein once remarked of a very, very different city, there is no there there. Until 50 years ago, there was no there there. Given its marginality and reputation for backwardness, the region's transformation into a semi-autonomous Adawi statelet in 1920 was a source of great scandal for some Syrians, but of course a boon for the Adawis themselves. True, some Adawis participated in revolts against the French in 1919, and many Adawis remained tepid toward French mandatory power. But as the Mandate wore on, enthusiasm for the French only warmed. Indeed, by the time of the Great Arab Revolt, which I mentioned, in Druze, 1925 to 1927, most Adawis chose to remain on the sidelines of the conflict, content with the political autonomy they enjoyed thanks to their new European masters. In 1936, as part of an agreement with the surging Syrian nationalists, France agreed to transfer control of the Adawi state to the city of Damascus. In protest, Adawi notables petitioned the governor in Latakia, the coastal city here, that served as the capital of the Adawi statelet. They petitioned him to establish a permanent Adawi state for them. As minorities, they claimed, they risked subjugation at the hands of Syria's Sunni majority. Furthermore, like the Jews of Palestine, whom the British had promoted and protected over often and against the interests of Palestinian Muslims, the only way to secure the safety of the Alawis, or so they claimed, was to grant them full sovereignty. Unfortunately, their petition fell on deaf ears, and the delegation returned home, resigned to an uncertain future. Among the petitioners that day in 1936 was the grandfather of future President and nationalist par excellence, Hafiz al-Assad. For Assad and his generation, that is the son, the man who became president, the lessons of French occupation were clear. If the Alawis could not achieve autonomy through the creation of a sectarian canton of their own, they would will themselves to power by becoming the standard bearers of the Arab mainstream. The French had greased the way for this. Throughout their 20-year rule of Syria, they had installed Alawis and other minorities, including Armenians and Circassians, as members of the so-called Troupe Spéciale, elite military units designed for deployment to troubled hotspots under French control. This was part of a wider strategy of divide and rule, intended to keep the Sunni Muslim majority in check. Indeed, by winning the loyalty of the Alawis and other minorities in the region, the French hoped to weaken any possibility of resistance in their colonial backyard. It was a ruthless but effective tactic. From Mount Lebanon to the Alawi heartlands of the north, the French managed to weave an overlapping network of sectarian loyalists who prized a sort of half-hearted autonomy under the French versus outright independence under what many feared would be a threatening Sunni majority. In this, the French were carrying on a long tradition of cultivating minorities as middlemen, a practice whose roots go back to the 16th century, if not certainly earlier. Thus, the minorities became a wedge, foiling aspirations for true independence by insisting on and receiving special treatment. In 1944, the Arab Republic of Syria received full independence. From the frontiers of Turkey to the northern stretches of Transjordan, Syria would constitute an integral geographic and political unit. Many of Syria's minorities acquiesced quietly to this, recognizing that their faith lay with the Sunni Muslims, whether they liked it or not. Many minorities learned to overcome their skepticism by enthusiastically muscling their way into the mainstream. Specifically, when it became clear that they would no longer profit by preserving a sense of sort of sectarian particularism, the Alawis began flooding the ranks of what was at the time the most robustly Arab nationalist movement in the country, the Ba'ath Party. Thus, the very community that had stood at odds with the majority, by dint of its religious heresy and geographic isolation, became the leaders of a party that alleged adamantly to transcend sectarianism in the name of Arabness. Armed with this new raison d'etre, and paired with a long tradition of military service to boot, the Alawis became defenders of Michel Aflaq's eternal Arab message. The Alawis may have earned political credibility as the guardians of Arabness, but the regime established by the Ba'ath, and later headed by Hafiz al-Assad, never managed to shake its attachment to its original sectarian community, or I should say, among the most important sectarian communities that facilitated its rise. Indeed, despite its pretensions to embrace all Syrians and to incorporate individuals from a range of backgrounds into the party leadership, many continue to look upon Baathism as the ideological facade for a much narrower agenda of Alawi rule. This view was especially pronounced among Sunni Muslims. To be sure, the Ba'ath Party incorporated many different kinds of Syrians into the government. But the top posts, especially in the executive branch, those around the president, and above all in the security services, often belonged to Alawis. Many Sunnis in Syria were unhappy with this. It was not only unjust, but in their eyes also deeply embarrassing. Sophisticated Syria had, by their worst fears at least, their stereotypical fears, had been hijacked by a cabal of country bumpkins. Indeed, old Damascenes would speak derisively of the influx of Alawis into the capital after the Ba'ath Party coup of 1963, and the second coup that brought then Defense Minister Hafez al-Assad to power as president in 1971. They called it the invasion of the Qaf. What is the Qaf? This refers to the tendencies of Alawis from the northwest to pronounce the Q sound in Arabic, Qaf, with bracing clarity. Unlike the softer, gentler Arabic of Damascus, in which the Qaf disappears into an elegant glottal stop. So as an example of this, if you were from the northwest of Syria, the verb I said in Arabic, you can pronounce it properly, and if you enunciate the Qaf with a strong thing, you'd say, qultu, I said. If you're from Damascus, where the Arabic is much lighter, you say qultu. It disappears into the back of your mouth. So this was the invasion of the Qaf. So a friend in Damascus once relayed a joke about this Alawi invasion during the 1960s and 70s. My friend was a Sunni Muslim. I should say not a particularly religious one, but nonetheless, I think stereotypes transcend whether you pray. He asked me, did you ever notice that the Alawis all had the same shaped head? I confessed I had not. So he explained further. Well, if you look at a picture of President Assad, by that he meant Hafez al-Assad, or if you drive around the city of Latakia, you'll see that lots of Alawis have the same shaped head. It's wide and very flat in the back, like a pancake. And indeed, if you look at pictures of President Assad, I'm not saying all Alawis have it, but President Assad has a particularly flat back of the head. So I knew the punchline was coming, and so obliging, I asked my friend why their heads looked like pancakes. Well, he said, when an Alawi woman gives birth to a son up in the mountains, the first thing she does is hang him upside down and smack him in the back of the head and order him, get to Damascus, get to Damascus. Which in Arabic's, Ruh Hashem, you smack the back of the head. Of course, my friend's joke was somewhat lighthearted, mildly insulting, but underlying it was a deeper sense that Syria's Alawi masters were undeserving of the power they wielded. And I should say, obviously, that these views are not monolithic. I think it's often true that jokes of a religious nature, of an ethnic nature, are obviously very often untrue. But the very nature of these sorts of jokes, whether in our society, and perhaps especially in the Middle East, is that they enshrine a sliver of truth, or at least a sliver of how many people perceive the truth. So I do this not to insult any Alawis, if there are any in the audience, but rather to give you a sense of what people think about on the ground. For a long time, the regime, its non-Alawi supporters and observers outside, downplayed the sectarian aspect of politics in Syria. It's more complicated than just the Alawis, was their constant refrain. And indeed it was for a long time, when the Ba'ath Party relied on a spectrum of communities to hold its power. But since the start of the revolution in March 2011 and the transformation of the conflict into a Sunni-Alawi civil war, we've seen how sectarian identity has remained crucially important for the Ba'ath Party. During the course of the present civil war, vast legions of Sunni conscripts in the Syrian army have left. They've abandoned. Many high-ranking Sunni generals have also fled the country. And increasingly, the Sunni business class, once a tacit partner in Ba'ath Party rule, has withdrawn its support from the regime. Although many prominent Sunnis, to say nothing of Christians and Druze, continue to stand with the regime, this has left behind a state and a security apparatus that relies ever more on its Alawi base to fight, to finance, and to fuel their struggle. At the same time, the opposition, which as I said began as a peaceful protest movement, has taken up arms. Along the way, it has attracted a spectrum of Islamist groups, both homegrown and from abroad. It is these groups from abroad who do the heavy lifting on the battlefield. Groups that are committed to wiping out Bashar al-Assad and what they view as the heretical community that supports him. So, to illustrate this point, I want to show you two clips from YouTube. You know, we are in the age of social media, and news about the Syrian revolution often filters out online. So I don't use Twitter, but I'm on YouTube a lot. And I thought I'd give you a sense of what people in Syria are doing, and the sorts of images, the sounds, the sayings that fuel sectarian tension in society. So the first clip comes from a YouTube channel belonging to a supporter of the Syrian revolution. It shows a group of Alawi militiamen who were called Shabiha. You may have heard that word in newspapers. These are basically Alawi irregulars, thugs, who were then brought into the regime to provide military support. So it's these guys hanging out in a captured Sunni mosque. As you'll see, they're shown smoking, drinking tea, and mocking the manner in which Sunnis would pray. And below the video, which you don't have on the screen, lots and lots of angry Sunnis have left angry quotes. Go to hell, basically, you heretics. So this does not have subtitles, but you don't need subtitles to get what's going on, so I'll play it. Before I do, let me turn this on. Because I imagine many of you are not Arabic speakers, I'll just play the video and you won't have audio. But what they're doing is the important thing. So, and the next video does have subtitles. So you see the guy here in the front is hanging out. You're not supposed to smoke in the mosque. You're not supposed to smoke in church either. So what he's doing is he's calling his buddies to basically do a pantomime Sunni Muslim prayer. And what you can't hear is that they're laughing the whole way through. This basically resembles the manner in which Sunnis pray. A lot of these gestures are vaguely modeled on what you would actually do if you were in a mosque for, shall we say, more upstanding reasons. What they're doing here is essentially mocking the guys that they're fighting against. And this drives people nuts. Anyway, so you get the picture. So our next video is a little more explicit. This second one comes from a Syrian cleric named Adnan al-Arbur, who's an extremely conservative Sunni Muslim preacher who broadcasts a popular television show from Saudi Arabia. His views increasingly reflect those of many in the opposition, who not only despise the regime for its political crimes, but also for the beliefs of its Alawi leadership. So I think this video provides a hyperbolic, if telling, window into the sectarian tensions within the opposition. Memory is a media service that translates important news clips from Middle Eastern languages and provides subtitles. So we will just read the subtitles. So with these images in mind, I want to leave you with a thought. Among the great tragedies of the Syrian uprising has been the disappearance of a notionally inclusive Arab nationalist ideology. This has exposed the raw flesh of the sectarian calculus in Syria, which pits a predominantly Sunni Muslim opposition, especially members of the lower classes, who were asphyxiated by the failed land reforms of President Hafez al-Assad, as well as the crony capitalism that took root in the early years of the presidency of his son, against the Alawi ruling clique. But the Alawis have not profited uniformly from Ba'athist rule, far from it. Poverty has remained trenchant throughout parts of the Alawi heartlands, prompting periodic revolts, including one famous insurrection against the government in 1969 that ended in an especially bloody crackdown. Still, in an age in which Ba'athism has become the religion of many secularly minded Alawis, who live in fear of sectarian reprisals by the Sunni majority, the future of the regime has become the fate of the whole community. Not all Alawis profited from the rise of the House of Assad, but mark my words, all will suffer for its sins. Throughout this talk, I have argued that the modern phenomenon of sectarianism in Syria was born of an unresolved tension between two opposing forces. On the one hand, sectarian particularism, namely, the power of religion to produce deep and enduring cleavages in society, to generate the kinds of identities that can overpower weaker ties of nationalism and party politics. On the other hand, there is political universalism, especially the efforts of 19th and 20th century reformers to devise new kinds of political association that transcended the narrow confines of sect for a shared politics, culture, and language. To a large extent, Arab nationalists like Hafez al-Assad suppressed, at least publicly, the strength of sectarian identity in Syria. In its place, they concocted a notionally inclusive Syrian national identity, one that was deliberately blind to older, more traditional forms of loyalty. Now, however, under the strain of a civil war that has discredited nationalism and other non-religious, non-communitarian forms of political identity, sectarianism has reasserted itself with powerful and destructive consequences. And personally, I'm not optimistic about this. Thank you.
Christian will take questions. Those of you who need to leave, we realize it's after 9, so feel free to do so. But if anyone has questions, please raise your hand.
Yes, sir.
Could you say a word about the role of Iran in these conflicts?
In the sectarian conflict or the conflict generally?
Because Iran is Shia.
Yeah, absolutely. So what the gentleman is referring to is an important idea that was tossed around in the media around the Iraq War. That one way of explaining Iran's foreign policy loyalties in the region is to see something called the Shi'i crescent. Iran is a predominantly Shi'i country, and its allies in the region include groups like Hezbollah, which is the Lebanese militant group and political party, also Shi'i, and then the regime in Syria, which is, as we found out, controlled by members of a Shi'i sect. Personally, I think this is widely overplayed. I think that there are geostrategic considerations that can account for the alliance between Tehran and Damascus. I think that religion is a secondary thing. As I was explaining, most Muslims, Sunni and Shi'i alike, have traditionally looked upon the Alawis essentially as being heretics. I know that's a hard word, but that conveys the strength of the opinion, so to speak. As a result of the political alliance that you refer to, there have been efforts, religious and cultural efforts, to rehabilitate the Alawi, so to speak. So over the past 50 years, after they have come to prominence in politics, there have been efforts to reach out to them, to bring them into Shi'i seminaries, for example, to write fatwas, Islamic religious rulings that describe the Alawis not as heretics, but rather as good, observant Muslims. But these efforts, these religious efforts to line up Iran and Syria, I think are secondary to the wider geostrategic issues. Yes, sir.
About a dozen years ago, Elijah Jami wrote a classic called The Green Palace of the Arabs. Basically, he wrote over a period of 25 years, starting in the 20s, these Arab leaders would rise, promised their people everything, and turn into nothing. And his conclusion was that words seem to be more important than deeds. Why is success for Syria and some of these other? What is their vision for their country?
It's hard to say. I mean, I don't think success is near. I think, from the perspective of the United States government, for example, success is clearly the toppling of Bashar al-Assad. That is the most proximate definition of success for the opposition also. But what comes after that is very hard to say. I mean, there are a lot of platitudes. For example, the Muslim Brotherhood, the largest and oldest member of this Islamist opposition, about a year ago issued a statement of beliefs in which they outlined their vision for Syria. And there were a lot of nice words in there about democracy and respect for other sects, and that Sharia, the Islamic religious law, would be one among many sources of legislation. But words are cheap, and it's very, very difficult to say what would come of this. So I think the ousting of Bashar and the Ba'ath Party, that's success. And once that common goal disappears, and you have these different rival factions, the liberal secularists, the not so liberal secularists, different groups within the Islamist opposition, they all have different ideas of what success means. And so in lots of ways, the battle is still to come. I think that this is going to be a very long conflict, and in this important respect, a two-stage conflict. Sir?
Do you anticipate any role for Lebanon in this process until it ultimately gets resolved?
I think it's a miracle, first of all, that Lebanon has not descended into violence already. I recently got back from a year in Lebanon. I was meant to be in Damascus, actually, and surprise, surprise, we were moved from Damascus to Lebanon. A few of my relatives, my mother sitting in the front row, a few of my relatives looked at me and said, "What the hell are you doing in Beirut? Who goes to Beirut because that's the safe option?" So to answer your question, there are two scenarios. One is the logical scenario, which says that Lebanon is basically consumed in the fires that are eating up Syria. And that certainly could happen. These countries are demographically indistinct in many ways. There are Alawites in Lebanon, a much smaller percentage of the population. There's an increasingly aggressive armed Sunni resistance that is fighting in Syria, but based in Lebanon. The Christians are involved. So for all those reasons, it could spill over. That said, I think that there is a consensus among the political leadership in Lebanon, which is historically divided between pro and anti-Syrian factions, that whatever their vested interest is in the Syrian revolution, it is in no one's interest for that fighting to spill across the border into our country. In other words, that long-term split in Lebanese politics will be resolved whether people are firing at each other in Beirut or not. And so let's carry on business. I mean, Lebanon is a country of merchants, basically. These are people who have been trading for hundreds of years, and so long as people are getting their checks, I think that they see the light, they see the reason not to start fighting. So, and that has been the story that has held true, surprisingly. So, yes, sir.
Last week we heard a pretty passionate plea from Andrew Slaughter about the U.S. aid problem. But I noticed in the New York Times today an article that the administration, which I think was considering aiding the rebels. Do you see a positive role for the United States in this?
My sense, and once again, I would defer to Andrew Slaughter. She actually makes decisions. I merely comment on those decisions. But what I would say is there are two things. Can the United States play a productive role, and a productive role that respects and is within the confines of public life, versus what the United States can do in absolute terms. In absolute terms, the United States has the ability to intervene. They have the ability to set up no-fly zones, to create humanitarian corridors that can get supplies to communities inside the country. Those are all the kinds of options that are available that fall short of putting boots on the ground. That said, I'm certainly not a military expert, but I have spoken with people who've done retired military who do war gaming. In other words, elaborate scenarios that predict the nature of a conflict if they were to occur. And they say the minimum U.S. troop commitment to do an effective job in Syria is at least 75,000. And I don't think the American public has an appetite for that. Once again, I'm not an expert. I don't quite understand how it's a both and scenario. I see it as either or. Does a no-fly zone necessarily entail Marines in Aleppo and Damascus? I'm not the person to ask that, but I think that President Obama recognizes this and recognizes that most voters are not interested. So I think it'll take a big jolt to get Washington engaged more than it is. Yes, sir.
How long do you think Assad can hold on to power, and if the government does collapse, who do you think will be the winning rebel force that will hold on?
I mean, everyone has been predicting that Bashar al-Assad would disappear by year's end. We're now coming up, this will be the end of 2013, this will be the third round of it, right? People thought he'd go at the end of 2011, people thought he'd go at the end of 2012. My prediction is he's going to be there at the end of 2013. And I think that for him also, the gentleman asked about success. How do we define success? At the beginning, I think success for Bashar al-Assad was the thorough wiping out of the opposition. The preservation of Syria according to its original borders, the reestablishment of authority under rebelling provinces. But I think increasingly he realizes that that is unfeasible. But at the same time, the regime is effective at defending itself. It is arming itself. There are daily flights from Tehran, apparently, with arms. And I think that they become more effective at fighting. So I have no prediction on when he will fall. I think very much like the onset of the Arab Spring, it seems inevitable. This system seems unsustainable. But whether it will be tomorrow or in 2 years, or whether this will be the Lebanese civil war that goes on for 15, I don't know. Remind me your second question.
If this government does collapse, which rebel sect will likely prevail?
Yeah, that is also a big unknown. We often read about these people who are sitting in the Gulf and who are sitting in Istanbul and sitting in Paris, and we assume that they are the spokesmen for the Syrian people, that they have the legitimacy. But this is a conflict, and a very bloody one, and I suspect that the leadership of post-Assad Syria will not emerge from the diplomatic conference, the quiet meeting, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, who will emerge from the battlefield. And the guys who are really carrying the weight and fighting the regime most successfully are these hardcore Islamists. And that's the great worry.
Can you discuss the Russian motivation?
Yeah. It is confusing.
Yeah. Just the motivations of the Russians.
Yeah. You ever hear that? This is the question about Russia's involvement in the Syrian conflict. Why is Russia invested in a civil war that's thousands of miles from Moscow and seemingly unconnected from its geostrategic concerns? I think there are a few things. One is that although the Soviet Union fell, I think Russia's foreign policy in certain ways did not change. And so as a lot of these Middle Eastern countries peeled off, Syria was a mercurial but more or less steady ally of the Soviet Union. And so this is a long-standing relationship they would like to continue to nurture. So that's a general observation. One of the most important is that Russia's only Mediterranean port is in fact in Syria. So this is Latakia, which is Syria's principal port, is also the base of it's a Russian Navy base. So that's another thing. And a more thematic issue that people talk to is that the Russians, who have their own long history of dealing with the Islamist insurgency in Chechnya, look upon Syria and see a conflict that is thematically familiar to them. And which, so in other words, a secular, forward-looking government that is trying to keep its hands on to a religiously motivated or fundamentalist insurgency. So those are three kind of disparate things, but this is about power and influence.
Is there evidence of Sunnis of the Al-Qaeda type moved into Syria to fight on the insurgency?
Yes. That is very clear. I know from personal experience living in Lebanon, the city of Tripoli. Tripoli is not marked on the map, it is the northernmost city of Lebanon. Only a couple dozen miles from the Syrian border. That has become a major way station for fundamentalist fighters, especially Al-Qaeda affiliates entering Syria. And this is what worries the United States government. To go back to the gentleman's question, why is President Obama hesitant about doing these? There's deep concern if you give someone a machine gun, is that guy going to turn that machine gun on you in a year? So it is a strange time when Al-Qaeda in the United States have a confluence of interests. But it's
Last question.
What do you see as the interests of Jordan, Israel, Iraq, Turkey, the countries around Syria, while if Syria totally implodes?
Well, I think the most basic is that they have to deal with a society that is coming apart at its seams. So they have certainly picked their favorites in this matter. But at the same time, if the regime survives, or if their allies win and society breaks apart, they have to deal with the mess. And so I think that there's a clear tension here, and that's why they're so heavily invested. So on the one hand, they have their favorites, but they want their favorites for their favorites so that they don't have to deal with it. But each of these countries has different considerations. So, for example, Israel. Israel is at a formal state of war with Syria and has been for decades. The Golan Heights being a major sticking point. This highland region down here that was taken by Israel during the 1967 Six-Day War. The irony of this is that despite a constant rhetoric of hostility towards the state of Israel, this has been the quietest border in the Middle East for decades and decades. And so this is why, for example, Israel has been relatively quiet in the course of this conflict, because they realize that in many ways, they don't profit from an unstable Syria that is controlled by people who are still their enemies. In other words, Islamists can control the government rather than secular Baptists. So time is running out, so I'll only remark on Turkey, which has an extremely interesting stake in this. Turkey is and has been under the control of a so-called moderate Islamist party, the AKP, for the past, I think, 12 years or so. I think 2000 was when it came to power, maybe 99. And among the significant foreign policy changes of the AKP when they came to power was a policy of so-called no problems with neighbors. So after decades and decades of control under secular nationalist groups that cultivated alliances with places like Israel, like the United States, Turkey decided to turn its attentions on its neighbors, with whom it had famously hostile, tense relationships. So who is Turkey's biggest neighbor to the south? It's Syria. And so, as a result of this, Syria was flooded with Turkish television shows and Turkish dry goods, Turkish clothes, everything was Turkish. But the revolution happens, and an aspect of the identity of that government is that it is an Islamist, a Sunni Islamist government. So they cannot be seen supporting the actions of a regime that is in turn cracking down on its own Sunni Muslim population. So at the start of the revolution, we had a very dramatic about-face in which Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey went from being very chummy with Bashar al-Assad to being his most staunch opponent. So right now, Turkey is among the major staging grounds for attacks into northern Syria. There's a lot of military training that's going on, arming of rebels, and all of that through a country that, in a matter of years ago, was one of Syria's most promising and important allies.